Had you ever heard of the simple yet life-saving engineering secret that brought home 20 soldiers who, statistically speaking, should have already been dead? Soldiers who survived walking coffins reduced to ash within seconds. As Allied tanks burst into flames one by one in the hedgerow fields of Normandy, what was the revolution that transformed Sherman tanks from fireballs into the miracle of wet storage, a discovery once deemed impossible? In those terrifying moments of combat where seconds determined the difference between becoming a hero who returns home and a name on the casualty list, how did the wet stowage system change the fate of a tank crew and save the lives of hundreds of soldiers? The date was June 14, 1944, the 8th day after D-Day. The hedgerow-lined fields of Normandy bore the footprints of war. 2 miles south of Carentan, behind a stone wall, Sergeant Michael Kowalski peered forward through the periscope inside his tank. The tank's engine labored. 300 meters away, a Sherman burned. Pitch-black smoke rose from around the tank, devouring the yellow morning light as it climbed into the sky. As the crew scrambled out of the tank and sprinted through tall grass, one man had fallen behind the others. A soldier who noticed his trailing comrade stopped, turned back and grabbed him by the arm. In an instant, both men collapsed. Shrapnel scattered by the explosion of the burning Sherman had cost both friends their lives. This was the 4th Sherman destroyed in the last 20 minutes. Confronted by the sight before him, Kowalski immediately reached for the radio. Baker 2-3 to Baker Central. There is an 88mm flak gun concealed in the tree line. We request a smokescreen and authorization to withdraw. The radio crackled in reply. Baker 2-3, there will be no withdrawal. Intelligence reports minimal armored presence in the area. Continue your advance. Sergeant Kowalski clenched his teeth. Minimal armored presence, was it? Some officer back at headquarters was reading yesterday's reconnaissance report, utterly unaware that 5 soldiers had been killed under enemy fire today. He glanced at Private Danny Castellano, the ammunition loader. The 19-year-old from Brooklyn was checking the ready rack while his hands trembled. 4 75mm shells stood at the ready, and 17 more sat in the turret basket of the tank. 30 rounds were stored in compartments on the hull sponsons directly above the tracks. 51 rounds in total, 51 shells capable of turning the 30-ton steel heap they sat inside into a crematorium, should a single Nazi shell penetrate. With all these thoughts churning through him, Sergeant Kowalski issued his order. Driver, advance 50 paces. Gunner, keep your eyes on that tree line. The Sherman lurched forward. Corporal Morrison, the gunner, swept the periscope along the hedgerow. I can't see anything, Sergeant. No muzzle flash, no movement, Morrison called out. It has to be out there somewhere. It knocked out 4 Shermans. Now it's waiting for us, Sergeant Kowalski replied. The Sherman advanced 30 paces more. The wall was now behind them. They were in the open, silhouetted against the green field. Kowalski's hands were sweating. Every instinct screamed at him to pull back and hide behind the wall. But his orders were clear. When the 88mm Nazi gun fired, the first blow came from the right, at a low angle. Kowalski felt the gun before he heard it. A metallic crack was followed by a pressure wave that compressed the entire crew compartment. The shell had disintegrated on entry, spraying white-hot steel splinters throughout the crew space. One fragment struck the hull sponson ammunition rack. The 75mm rounds ignited and began detonating instantly. The hull sponson blew apart in a chain reaction. 30 shells exploded one after another, each detonation triggering the next. Within minutes, the temperature inside the crew compartment had multiplied many times over. The ready rack behind Castellano had caught fire as well. 4 shells detonated simultaneously, turning the loader's seat into a blast furnace. Sergeant Kowalski grabbed Castellano by the shoulder and tried to drag him toward the turret hatch. But Castellano's uniform was already on fire. Morrison was faster. The gunner kicked open his hatch and leapt out, landing hard on the engine deck. Kowalski tried to push Castellano out, but Castellano could no longer move on his own. He was only screaming. At that moment, another explosion ripped through the turret basket. The hatch slammed violently shut. Kowalski was hurled backward toward the radio set. He tasted blood in his mouth. His left arm wasn't responding. Thick, poisonous smoke had engulfed every inch of the tank. Kowalski could see neither Castellano nor anything else. The commander found the tank hatch by feel. The metal lid was hot enough to burn through his gloves. He shoved it open with his shoulder and forced himself outside. The moment he threw himself clear, clean air struck him like a slap across the face. He rolled off the tank turret and fell 6 feet below, then began to crawl. Behind him, the Sherman's ammunition was still cooking off. Flames shooting from every open hatch and port. He crawled 20 paces before his arms gave out. He collapsed onto the grass and watched his tank come apart. 5 minutes later, Morrison found him. The gunner's face was burned, smoke still rising from his uniform. "Where's Castellano?" he asked. Kowalski could not answer. Both men already knew what had happened to Castellano. 3 kilometers to the east, a very different story was being written. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes was pushing his platoon of 4 Shermans forward. All 4 were the M4A176W model. The supply sergeant who had handed the tanks over in England had told Hayes something about ammunition compartments and fire prevention, but Hayes's mind had been fixed on the new 76mm gun. Higher muzzle velocity meant better armor penetration. That was how you survived on the battlefield, or so he had believed. Hayes's platoon was advancing through the same hedgerow terrain where Sergeant Kowalski's Sherman had been destroyed. The same concealed tanks, the same deadly geometric kill zones awaited them. Hayes's lead tank was commanded by Sergeant William Drake. The moment Sergeant Drake's Sherman turned a corner, it entered the range of a German panzer. A 75mm shell struck the hull sponson from 300 meters. Hayes watched through binoculars. He waited for the explosion, for the turret to fly into the air, for the crew to come burning out. None of it happened. Drake's Sherman shuddered from the impact. Smoke was rising from the entry hole, but there was no secondary detonation. No chain reaction explosion occurred. The tank turret remained in place. 5 seconds later, the Sherman's gunner began returning fire. The 76mm gun bellowed once. The German panzer's turret rang like a bell. The German tank sat motionless as smoke began pouring from its engine deck. Sergeant Drake's voice came over the radio. "Baker 31 to Baker Central. We've been hit, but we're still mobile. A round penetrated the right hull sponson. No casualties. Ammunition compartments are fully intact. Continuing the advance." Hayes stared at the radio handset. No casualties. Ammunition compartments fully intact. This was impossible. He had watched every Sherman that took a gun hit to the hull, sponson burst into flames. Drake's tank should have been burning, but it wasn't. Hayes snatched the handset and spoke. "Drake, say again, you took a penetrating hit to the hull sponson." "That's correct, sir. The shell passed through the ammunition rack, but nothing ignited. Our rounds in the magazine are stored close to the floor, inside liquid-filled containers. It missed the stowed ammunition," Sergeant Drake replied. The wet stowage concept had worked. At that moment, Hayes recalled what the supply sergeant had told him. In the up-armored Shermans, ammunition was not stored in open racks on the hull sponsons, but in sealed compartments on the floor, surrounded by containers filled with a mixture of water and ethylene glycol. When a shell penetrating the tank struck the ammunition area, this liquid was released and spread throughout the space, extinguishing any flames before combustible material could ignite. It sounded absurd. Who would bother designing individual water jackets for each ammunition compartment? Yet because of this seemingly absurd method, Drake's crew was alive. The tank was still fighting. Everything else was merely detail. The platoon pressed on for 4 hours. They engaged 6 German tanks and 8 anti-tank positions. The tanks absorbed hits in 11 separate locations. 3 tanks were knocked out by track damage or engine fire. But not a single Sherman burned from an ammunition cook-off. Not one crew member was killed. When evening came, Hayes radioed his daily situation report to the unit commander. After listening to the account, the commander asked Hayes with a hint of jest, "Have you started using magic tanks?" Hayes glanced at his M4A176W, its right flank blackened by the gun hit it had absorbed. The paint was stripped away and the steel armor was scorched. But his crew was making coffee on a portable stove, joking about the German gunner's terrible aim. "This isn't magic, sir, just better engineering," Hayes said. 300 miles to the east, at a Wehrmacht supply depot near Falaise, First Lieutenant Klaus Werner was reading a troubling intelligence report. Werner was a hard-bitten German panzer commander fresh from the Eastern Front. The report described a disturbing development. American Sherman tanks were no longer igniting and exploding after taking hits to their ammunition compartments. Werner read the report twice. He could not make sense of it. The Sherman's vulnerability to ammunition fires had been a well-known fact among German commanders since North Africa. Hit a Sherman's hull sponson, aim the shell toward the turret basket and the ammunition racks, and the Sherman exploded like a bomb. The crew scrambled to escape from inside the tank. Those who could not get out perished within. Those who did manage to escape found themselves in the middle of the machine gun fire that waited for them outside. Werner had destroyed 11 Sherman tanks using this method while retreating from Kursk. But according to the intelligence report, something had changed. Werner gathered the other tank commanders and read the report aloud with them once more. "This is propaganda," said Ernst Becker, commander of the lead German tank platoon. "The Americans want us to swallow the idea that their tanks are invincible. This is psychological warfare. Perhaps you're right, and it is propaganda. But what if the Americans have genuinely solved the problem of Sherman ammunition compartments igniting and exploding? Then we need to know the answer to that question. Because our entire military doctrine right now is built around destroying Sherman tanks quickly. If that is no longer valid, we will need to revise our approach and our doctrine," Werner replied. The following morning, Werner's platoon encountered a formation of 8 American Sherman tanks. an armored unit moving across open farmland near Villers-Bocage. Werner deployed his panzers behind a tree line, a classic German ambush with clear fields of fire ahead. The American armored unit was moving without infantry support, fully exposed as an open target. Werner's gunner locked onto the lead Sherman at 800 meters. Target acquired, Sherman tank 800 meters, requesting permission to fire. Fire! Werner's voice thundered. The 75mm gun roared like lightning. Shells punched into the Sherman's right flank, just above the tracks. Werner watched through his binoculars and waited for the expected explosion. The hit Sherman lurched from the impact, then smoke began curling from the entry hole. The tank's advance halted. Its track had been damaged, but there was no fire and no secondary explosion occurred. The tank turret remained in place. And at that moment, Werner felt his heart fill with dread. The Sherman's turret rotated toward his position. 5 seconds after taking the hit, the American tank opened fire. The shell whistled over Werner's panzer and slammed into the trees behind, detonating there. But the message had been received. The Sherman was still fighting. Werner's second panzer fired as well. The shell struck the front of the Sherman's turret and glanced off the cast steel. The Sherman returned fire. This time, the shell found its mark. The German tank burst into flame. In the chain reaction explosion that followed, the crew perished inside without being able to escape. Werner felt his stomach tighten. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had perfect ambush positions, resolute gunners, ammunition that had scored first-hit strikes on stationary targets at optimal range. Yet the American tanks were prevailing. The remaining Shermans, the moment they spotted the hit tank, accelerated their advance and drove straight into the heart of the German ambush. Werner's gunners fired 3 more rounds and received 2 additional hits in return. One Sherman lost a track and was pinned in place, but the other 5 Shermans continued firing on the move, pounding Werner's position with high-explosive shells. Along the tree line, a hell of steel and splinters was shredding everything in sight. Werner ordered a withdrawal. 3 German panzers escaped. 2 German panzers, struck by 76mm shells that tore through their forged steel armor like paper, continued to burn. The Americans had lost 2 tanks. 2 more were knocked out but not destroyed. As far as Werner could observe, American tank losses were 0. That evening, Werner wrote a detailed after-action report. He documented the unexpected resilience of the American Sherman tanks. Tanks that had absorbed multiple hits without suffering ammunition cook-offs, and crews whose survival rates were far higher than in previous engagements. He requested an urgent investigation and proposed a tactical adaptation. Werner's report reached Army Group B headquarters within 3 days. Intelligence officers read it with mounting concern. Werner was not the only field commander reporting this. Similar accounts were flowing in from across the Normandy front. Reports from every German unit describing American Sherman tanks that continued to fight after absorbing hits that should have destroyed them, and crews who kept on fighting without so much as a bloody nose. The central question was, what had changed? The answer to that question lay 5,000 miles away, on the tank assembly lines in Detroit, Michigan. Fisher Body Division, a subsidiary of General Motors, had converted its automotive manufacturing plants to military production in early 1942. By 1944, the factory was producing 300 M 4A3 model Sherman tanks per month. Every tank carried the letter W, designating wet stowage. It was engineering of a revolutionary character. The system was elegantly simple. Each 10-round compartment contained 3 small sealed reservoirs filled with a mixture of water, ethylene glycol, and rust inhibitor, a proprietary compound called amudamp. When a shell penetrating the tank struck the ammunition storage area, these reservoirs were punctured and released the liquid. The liquid then spread and extinguished any flames before they could reach combustible material. The system added 400 kilograms to the tank's weight, but it reduced the risk of an ammunition fire by 85%. In practical terms, this meant that crews could escape even from severely damaged tanks. The Shermans were still vulnerable. They could not match German heavy armor, but they were no longer death traps. Production of the armored Shermans began in January 1944. By April, 130 tanks had been shipped to England. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions took delivery of 52 armored tanks. But training concerns related to the new 76mm gun delayed their deployment in the field. The first M4A176W model Sherman tanks entered combat on July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. Soldiers serving in American armored units reported surviving hits that would have killed them long before. Thanks to the wet stowage Shermans, accounts circulated of tanks riddled with armor-piercing rounds, yet with crews walking away unharmed. This news spread rapidly beyond the front lines, through the armored divisions. The new model Shermans were the tanks that kept their crews alive. Soldiers who had witnessed their comrades burn to death in older models now had a genuine chance of survival. Morale among the troops improved tremendously as a result. Attack tactics became more viable. Tank commanders took risks they would never have dared in the older fire-prone models. Sergeant Michael Kowalski, who had thrown himself out of his destroyed Sherman at the last possible moment, returned to the front in September 1944 after recovering from his wounds. His new tank was an M4A3 76W model Sherman. He noticed the difference immediately compared to his previous tank. The ammunition racks were different. There were sealed compartments and liquid-filled containers surrounded the loader's position. "They call it wet stowage. It keeps us from burning if we get hit," said the ammunition loader. Kowalski ran his hands along the smooth metal compartments. "Does it work?" he asked. "I don't know, Sergeant. I haven't been hit yet," the loader replied. "Let's keep it that way," said Sergeant Kowalski. 3 weeks after that exchange, near Aachen, Kowalski's Sherman took a round from a German Panther at 700 meters. The shell punched through the right hull sponson, straight to the spot where Castellano had died in the old tank, straight to the place where Kowalski had expected to die once again. The impact threw Kowalski against the turret wall, the crew compartment filled with smoke. He heard the loader shouting, but there was no secondary explosion, no chain reaction. The interior was filled with smoke, and the hiss of fluid seeping from the punctured ammunition compartments could be heard. Kowalski grabbed the loader and pushed him toward the commander's hatch. The soldier climbed out, coughing, alive. The gunner jumped out through his own hatch. The driver and co-driver escaped through the front hatch. Kowalski was the last to leave the tank, pulling himself out through the smoke-filled turret and rolling off the engine deck. All 5 crew members had survived. Kowalski stretched out on the grass and watched his tank burn. The ammunition compartments held firm. The wet stowage system was working even as the engine fire spread forward. Eventually, the flames would reach the shells and they too would cook off. But by the time the explosion came, the crew was 200 paces away, behind safe lines. At that moment, Kowalski thought of Castellano. 19 years old, a kid from Brooklyn. He had burned to death 3 seconds after the shell struck the Sherman when the ammunition cooked off. He thought of the 11 other crew members he had watched die the same way during the Normandy campaign. The wet stowage system would not bring them back. It would not erase the horror of North Africa, of Sicily, of those first days in Normandy. But from January 1944 onward, as modified Sherman tanks reached the front lines, the death rate had fallen by 85%. Thousands of American, British, Canadian, and Free French tank crew members had survived hits that would have killed them months earlier. Hits that now left them without so much as a bloody nose. Kowalski got to his feet, brushed himself off, and walked toward the company commander. He would request a replacement tank, an M4A 376W, if possible. Because within seconds, he had learned the hard way just how different dying and surviving truly feel. And in war, seconds were the difference between going home and becoming a name on the casualty list. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes came home from the war alive. His M4A 176W platoon, which had engaged German armor in dozens of engagements from Normandy to the Elbe River, lost 11 tanks. 7 were repaired and returned to service. 4 were written off as total losses due to heavy damage. But not a single tank burned from an ammunition cook-off. Hayes brought his entire platoon home alive. 20 men who, statistically speaking, would have been killed in older model Shermans, returned home safe and sound. The history of the Sherman tank is still debated among historians. Some criticize its inadequacy against German heavy armor. Others champion its reliability, ease of production, and adaptability to varied combat terrain. But one fact is beyond debate. The wet stowage modification transformed the Sherman from a death trap into a fighting vehicle that kept its crew alive. It gave soldiers a real chance. And in war, that was enough. If you enjoyed our story, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on your notifications and activate the bell icon so you can be the first to hear about our new videos. As we always say, you are ambassadors of peace, helping us bring our community to every corner of the world. From which part of the world are you watching our channel? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Like the heroes featured in this video, you are part of keeping the memories of World War II alive. We are endlessly grateful. Stay well.